Important Germanic general Ricker, politicking puppet master behind the throne for going on 20 times a number of imperial campaigners, had fought for control of the remnants of the formerly potent realm, most of them losing their heads in the process, for it was not just gimmicks of Germanic descent who tried to hold sway over the declining drift from both within and without, but full, thoroughbred Romans too, just the former time though having all the support of Constantinople, potent capital of the eastern half of the empire and a good military birth, being the son of a celebrated general. The Emperor Julius Nepos had been outwitted, left adrift to rule over a rump state in Dalmatia. Much had changed since the days of Augustus and Hadrian, so numerous centuries ahead indeed. The Homeric capital itself had been moved in the wake of repeated sackings by heathens over the course of the 5th century, and in the 470s in the well-fortified imperial lair of Rena it was a certain Areses who now pulled the strings, but in rather of placing himself on the throne in a brazen decision it was his teenage son Romulus who would be made emperor. But Orestes easily failed to realize what was really going on when a group of Germanic officers arrived at court to ask for an increase in pay to ensure their continued fidelity. They were flatly refused, in verity the only reason Italy had not formerly been swamped by their far more uncultivated, un-Romanized relatives from beyond the borders of the realm. They took issue, heading to their master to demand commodity be done. His name was Odoacer, and so it was in late August 476 Areses was seized, paying for his insolence with his life. But when Odoacer set up himself in the presence of the youthful Romulus, only around 15 times old at the time, he took pity on the little emperor, transferring him to exile on a pastoral villa rather, and with that fairly simple act, the vaunted days of the Western emperors were over. Odoacer had relieved himself of the petty functionaries formerly and for all, and yet in actuality for the vast maturity of citizens life would go on just as it had before. Gathering up all the imperial caparison, Odoacer transferred it over to Constantinople, saying only one emperor would be necessary now, and pledging his allegiance officially. The West was still part of the Roman Empire, however, now under the sanctioned rule of a Romanized Germanic elite. Julius Nepos dallied on for another 4 times before he too was killed from also on. There would be no more Roman emperors in the West, and yet as we shall see the title would be revived numerous times over the coming 1,000 times, and a conception of a Roman was far from dead. Was there in verity ever a last Roman? Is similar a conception indeed possible? It's a question that has skewered chroniclers for centuries, since Procopius in the 6th century announcement, and particularly since Edward Gibbon in the 18th. There have been numerous campaigners for the title of last Roman, to gesture their valor and their virtue as Romans of old numbers who for one reason or another, due to some extraordinary material or scholarly achievements, were considered fit for such a title, from Flavius Stylo, loyal half-Vandal protector of the conglomerate betrayed and boggled by his own emperor, to the veritably last emperor himself, Constantine VI, who failed fighting the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Well over a glories latterly. Join us on this trip of 1,000 times as we trace the decline and fall of the Roman Empire through the individualities who did their utmost to save its actuality. In order to truly understand the fall of the conglomerate, we must go back to the veritably onsets of its fracture, to the war-riddled 4th century announcement. In those days, more frequently than not, the real adversary was a fellow Roman usurper or upstart general, generally by far the biggest pitfalls coming from the upper situations of the service rather than Germanic heathens. As American pen Ariel Durant formerly said, a great civilization isn't conquered from without until it has destroyed it itself from within. In 363 announcement, the last pagan Roman emperor and rescuer of Gaul, Julian, played his hand too numerous times, heading out on an ill-conceived crusade to Persia from which he'd no way return, now happy to simply escape with their lives. The dog-faces placarded Julian's lieutenant Jovian as their new emperor, spending close to a time making humiliating peace covenants and traveling back to Constantinople. He failed before he got there, in that age of czars and generals when only the strongest survived. A number of reserves were also put forward. All of them were grandly ranking generals from military families on the frontier. Eventually the stylish man for the job was chosen, a career dogface with decades of experience fighting the Germanic heathens who now yet again hovered to unmask over the Rhine into the empire. His name was Valentinian. In an unknown new situation of relative stability, Valentinian was suitable to appoint his family Violens as emperor in the east, whilst he set about pacifying the frontier in the west, proving to be exceptionally able in his position, methodically taking on one group of interferers after the other. Little did Valentinian know it, but he was to be the veritably last Roman emperor to crusade significantly on the other side of that great river Rhine, hedged to the barbarian world, marching deep into Germanic territory between 367 and 369. Whilst there, not only did he strengthen the colorful swash defenses and watch posts on the eastern side of the Swash, but he rebuilt and refurbished old and dilapidated castles, also erecting new bones. Valentinian easily had an eye for also able inferiors to dispatching the Hispanic general Theodosius to deal with a massive eruption of Britannia in 367 with only a small task force. Theodosius was suitable to bring the situation under control, winning himself and his family lasting fame in the process. We will hear from his son again at around the same time in 368. Valentinian moved into Germanic home that had formerly been enthralled by the Romans since abandoned during the chaos of the 3rd century, a situation which had first led to the perpetual investiture of frontier generals to the post of emperor. The Agri-Dieretes had been given up after the reign of Probus and since settled by the Alemanni, one of the most important ethnical confederations to crop in the 3rd and 4th centuries as a veritably real trouble to the substance of Roman Gaul. At Salicinium, Valentinian fought a large scale-pitched battle against the Alemanni led by their king Ran. The Romans were victorious but suffered substantial losses. Gone were the days of bloodless palms. The so-called heathens are now exercising tactics and technology not too different to the Romans. This was the veritably last time the Romans would ever win a major battle against Germanic lines deep in Germania. Just 4 decades laterally, not just the Alemanni but vast quantities of other neighboring confederations would cross over the Rhine, storming Valentinian's painstakingly constructed protective workshop and formerly over. They would no way leave. It was for this reason, for his emotional palms and for that last protuberance of Roman might beyond the borders of the frontier, that Valentinian would be flashed back as last of the Romans in 375. Valentinian failed of a stroke. We are told his youthful son Gratian came emperor of the West, but in the east where on the Danube frontier also disastrous events were brewing. His family Valens still ruled an entire barbarian confederation. The Goths, 2 nations to be precise, the Ingi and the Grat Tongi, had crossed the Danube into Roman home in 376, soliciting the Romans for protection against a much more intimidating foe which had come storming in from the east. The Huns had arrived in Europe up until the late 370s. Valens had been quite a successful emperor. Like his family Valentinian in the west, he successfully campaigned beyond the borders of the realm, heading across the Danube to master the Goths between 367 and 369, forcing them to sue for peace. Still this time, as knockouts of thousands of hopeless men, women and children poured into Roman homes, some of them refusing to give up their arms. There was no rule book to explain what to do. The posterior situation was poorly misruled by the original governors, performing in outright rebellion, by the Goths ultimately twisting into open war, and yet more Gothic soldiers crossed over the Swash in Persia. At the time, Valens was forced to give up his crusade against the Assassinates, heading back west to tete-a-tete deal with the precarious situation which was now brewing in Thessaly, where the Goths had now begun attacking metropolises and ruining the country. In 378, Tone arrived at Constantinople, supposedly prompted by the people of the megacity to attack the Goths incontinently and against the advice of Gracchi's councils, who prompted him to stay for mounts from the west. Vince set out for war, maybe fueled in part by his own pride. Without backup, Tone arrived at the megacity of Adrianople to engage the Goths. Originally the battle went well, but the Romans were soon overwhelmed by the clever tactics of the Goths and a ruinous surprise cavalry attack. In the heat of battle, Tone himself was cut down, joining the species of the veritably many Roman emperors to be killed in combat. Adrianople was relatively simply one of the topmost disasters the Roman conglomerate ever suffered in its fate. The Goths could now bat unchecked through Roman home for times, only being temporarily pacified by the new emperor Theodosius for Vale Lance, rather of achieving a grandiose palm and perpetuating himself as an idol. The defeat set a ruinous chain response into stir, which was signalized to the barbarian lines that the Romans could indeed be defeated. It would also set the dangerous precedent of Germanic lines being allowed to settle within Roman land, a so-called federa, a practice which would latterly spell doom upon the Western conglomerate, particularly when it was officially resolved into an independent reality upon the death of Theodosius. But by no means all Germanic dogfaces had the doom of the conglomerate on their minds. It was not long after the empire had been resolved into an eastern and a western part the doom would be spelled on the west in particular. Though the ancestral home of all Romans of late, it had fallen behind the rich spangling metropolises of the east, and Constantinople in particular as Homeric capital, decreasingly thin and unified state, didn't slightly fight against barbarian eruptions, seeking first and foremost the survival of their own half. They would frequently now scheme against each other, and indeed more disastrously fight civil wars within each half, weakening them indeed more oppressively, but especially in the West with its poorer businesses and much more accessible and open terrain, susceptible to being overrun by crowds of cavalry and bottom dogfaces. Likewise over the course of 80 times from New Year's Eve in 406 when a vast crowd of sway by defacers and Aulim crossed over the frozen R to the final fall of the general Syagrius last Western Roman remnant in 486 to Clovis's Frankish army the West would suffer a moping end and yet over the course of that near century there were numerous heroic characters who gave everything for the conglomerate, and there were preceding ages of peace when the Germanic raiders were subdued into pacificism and base aid to the imperial armies. Numerous of these individualities were called last Romans in ancient and ultramodern histories, maybe none more so still than Flavius Stylo, a half-Vandal and exceptionally able career soldier. Stylo had been born in 359 during the days when the empire had been whole. Joining the army at a youthful age he would risen through the species, eventually serving admirably as the stalwart right-hand man of the Emperor Theodosius I, latterly known as the Great, the successor to Vien's Eastern Empire and eventual sovereign of the West too. On Theodosius' death in 395 the conglomerate was resolved between his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. It fell to Stylo as Majus Militum or Master of the Dogfaces to watch over the Western boy king, also marrying into the royal family. By marrying Theodosius his family Stilicho service was exemplary from his manning of the northern frontier in Britannia against the PS and Scots to his defeat of Alary and the Vig Goths in 402. Maybe the topmost trouble however came in 405 when a potent Germanic king named Ragus descended upon Italy at the head of a vast crowd, allegedly with the express intention of immolating the emperor to the idolater god. Stylo was victorious, swatting away the adversary with extensively superior tactics, forcing them into submission through starvation, formally again defeating another force in 406 when yet more heathens crossed the Rhine to slip into Ga. Still despite these heroic sweats maybe stewing his ever-growing power, whilst also cautious of his Germanic heritage in 408 the Emperor Honorius, whom Stylo had devoted his entire life to guarding, had his potent general, one of Rome's topmost protectors, put to death just 2 times. Latterly the situation Stylo had done his utmost to avoid would come to pass. He would spend vast quantities of time and energy in negotiating with all Aelric and the Vig Goths, descendants of the victors of Adrianople, but now with still gone Aulern his army headed to Rome, where the great megacity was sacked and burned for the first time in 800 times for his inconceivable palms and valiant sweats to defend the eternal city. Edward Gibbon famously called Stylo last of the Romans in his masterpiece Decline and Fall of the Western Roman Empire, and Stylo may be above most others, is surely meritorious of that title, and yet others may be inversely as great, yet with lower and lower coffers to call from. Due to the hemorrhaging home of the West would arise again 3 times after the assassination of Stylo. A new figure would arise in the service of the Emperor Honorius, inheriting Stylo's part as Majus Militum of the West in 411. Although not called last of the Romans by any of the ancient or ultramodern sources, he surely deserves the title much further than numerous others on this list. His name was Constantius III, and it was he who managed to stabilize the conglomerate in the wake of the fall of Rome, allowing it to survive for another 65 times to come. An Ion by birth, Constantius steadily rose through the species of the service until in 411 he was given the loftiest rank of all, basically the undisputed master of the Western armies, though of late it was a state riven by usurpers and Germanic raiders. First on the docket was Constantine III, a rival emperor to Honorius who'd seized Britain and vast areas of Gaul and Hispania, yet it was Constantius who triumphed, reclaiming much of Gaul and Hispania though Britain would be lost. Ever coming Constantius embarked on juggernauts against the Germanic lines, who'd now managed to establish themselves on the home of the Western Empire. In 416 he defeated the Visigoths in northern Hispania, blockading them and forcing them into submission by means of starvation. Their king Woliya surrendered to Rome, and the Vig Goths were forced to come federa of the empire and to fight for them against the defacers. Galapia, the son of Theodosius, who had been captured in the sack of Rome in 408, was returned into Roman hands, getting the woman of Constantius. She'd go on to be a significant power behind the throne of the Western Empire for decades to come. In the following times Constantius continued campaigning against the heathens in Hispania and managed to regain vast tracts of home from the Goths, the defacers, and the SBY, therefore stabilizing the Western Empire that had come so dangerously close to decomposition. And after the eruptions of 406 and 421 he was indeed Medico Emperor of the West by Honorius, unfortunately, though he reigned only for 7 months before he failed in that same time, and this would be the last time that the Western Roman Empire would see some semblance of stability, for which he truly does earn the title last of the Romans. It was to be the defacers, also a fairly insignificant body in Hispania, who would go on the war path next. In 428 black cruises were descried off the seacoast of Africa. For centuries the Mediterranean had been clear of rovers, but now all that was to change, sailing south from Hispania in a great line where they'd been wearing and wandering for the once 20 times or so came a vast force of Knockouts of thousands of defacers and Alanik steed soldiers. Their destination was the soft underbelly of the empire and its breadbasket, the fiefdom of Africa, where the grain vessels to Italy demanded to keep sailing if the conglomerate was to survive, though the general who went to the defense of that most important of businesses was eventually unprofitable. In his attempts for his valiant sweats he was described by the annalist Procopius, jotting just over 100 times latterly, as the last of the Romans. That man was Count Boniface, or Bonasus as he's known by Procopius, first appearing as a general of Constantius III in 413. Bonasus held colorful posts over the preceding nearly 2 decades, proving himself a dependable and suitable dogface before defying the defacers in open field battle at Calama in 430. Unfortunately for Bonasus, the sovereign of the defacers was Gary, one of the topmost Germanic lords in history, who enough much no way lost a to battle in his entire career, and that day was no different. After the battle, Bonasus and his surviving dogfaces retreated to the megacity of Hippo Regius, home of the celebrated theologian and Saint Augustine of Hippo. Fortifying themselves in the megacity, the defacers also began a lengthy and brutal siege, eventually seizing the place in 431. It's allowed that Augustine himself failed in the chaos, yet Bonasus did not give up. Yet in early 432 he took to the field of battle formally, more this time with support from the Eastern Empire, Aspar the Alanik king maker behind the throne of Constantinople, dispatching a force to aid him when the Romans lost. That day it was the morning of the end for Roman Africa, with the metropolis of Carthage ultimately being seized and set up as the capital of a new Vandalic area for 100 times to come. Like all Roman generals of that age, Bonasus was also engaged in colorful civil wars against the other important Roman commanders in the west, most especially Flavius Felix and Flavius Eius. It's allowed, veritably likely by ultramodern chroniclers, that his failures against the defacers were due at least in part to the violent civil wars raging in the aft ground, effectively precluding a united front against the heathens, with Bonasus only being suitable to call on his immediate dogfaces of his own province. And yet, after winning a battle against Eius, the all-important Magister Militum in Gaul in 432, Bonasus, the last hope of Africa, mortally wounded, wed by a lance during the fighting, always acting to fight in the thickest of the combat, passed down its to his rival. That we must now turn. With the death of Bonasus in 432, Flavius Eius stood alone among the most important generals of the Western Empire, though unpopular with Galla Playa in Rena due to his politicking and ruthless climbing of the graduation of power and the payoff of numerous of her abettors. When Eius tete-a-tete rode to Rena at the head of an army of battle-hardened hunk mercenaries, the Rena administration had no choice but to axe numerous times before Flavius Eius had been fostered at the court of Alar the Visigoth himself. Before being handed on to Aline, king of the Huns, it was a nonage forged in bloodshed and fermentation, but one which forged one of the topmost generals in Roman history. Now all those times latterly he was still suitable to call on the support of the new Hunnic king Rugia, who he seems to have known as a youth. It was this capability to command genuine respect and service from so-called heathens from beyond the edge of the conglomerate that would make Eius into such a hustler, overseeing the conglomerate through its final phase of relative stability, and as we shall see, one final major extremity, arguably the topmost it would ever face, violently holding the West together in a time of maximum chaos and despair, and ultimately commanding the respect and service of virtually all dogfaces from Hispania to Gaul, Germanic mercenary and legionary. Likewise, for the last time ever, Eius first came to elevation in the medial 420s as an able general in service to the usurper Yanas. Backed up by his army of Hunts, he was suitable to talk his position upon Yan's death, arriving in Gore in 426 to take command of the Western army, a force 40,000 strong following the death of Honorius VI. Time-old Valentinian III now sat on the imperial throne, though the real power lay with his mama Galadia, who installed colorful generals similar as Eius with positions in the military. Eius was snappily suitable to subdue the Goths in Gaul before turning north to master the Franks, two blarneying pledges from all of them to serve him tete-a-tete should he need it. As a result, Eius was promoted to the position of Magister Militum, though still overbalanced by the overall commander of the army Flavius Felix. By 430, still following a feud, Felix was tracked down and pithily executed, apparently to for all Eios's own prosecution. Another conflict with Bonasus replaced, and though defeated on his march to Italy, Bonasus soon passed away and Eius returned to Italy to seize his position back as usual. At the head of a large Hunnic army reinstated as Magister Militum, Eius was now by far the potent power in the west, a position he'd hold for going on 20 times to come to the north of the Danube. Eius, his supporter Rugia, soon failed in 434, replaced as king of the Bergen Hunnic state by his whoresons, an aged youth named Better and a youngish by the name of a cultivator. After 2 decades of keeping order in the west, the east having largely suffered the wrath of the Huns in the meantime, ultimately led solely by a cultivator after the mysterious death of his family. The Hunnic army launched to the full-scale eruption of the West press, gaining multitudes of Germanic nations non-commercial into their service, driving alarmed peasants and slaves likewise before them across the plains of Gaul. Vast pitched battle that followed on the Catalonian plains in 451 EUs. His particular charisma was so great that the stager Vig Gothic King Theodori I Sovereign for an astonishing 33 times fought to the death on his behalf. The Huns were pushed back and Attila failed, not long after, leading to the bifurcation of the Hun Confederation. Like Stillo before him, still ETS's price for his service was an ignominious death, this time apparently by the veritably hands of the emperor himself, therefore plunging the conglomerate into maximum chaos. Formerly more Valentinian himself was boggled soon after by the revengeful guards of EUs, and only months latterly, ever opportunistic, the defacers under Giric sailed over to Rome to lay the megacity to waste yet again. The alternate time, in only 45 times yet more vicious civil wars, would post-date, only speeding the demise of the West. And without the strong arm of EUs keeping both Germanic mercenaries and Roman usurpers likewise in line through cunning and skillful tactfulness, it sounded only a matter of time before everything fell piecemeal for good. And yet there was one further stopgap, one last figure to try and save the empire. A grandson of one of Theodosius I's topmost generals, Majorian, came, a distinguished officer in the service of EUs, particularly making a name for himself against Clodagh, ruining Franks in the late 440s. In around 450, however, he fell out of favor after the emperor considered marrying his own son to the youthful general, a position EUs wanted for his own son. Majorian was disrated and only allowed to return to service upon Eosa's death in 454, eventually getting emperor in 457. In his short but astonishing reign of only 4 times, Majorian nearly managed to restore the Western Empire to its former extent with the aid of his able commanders Marcellus of Dalmatia, Nepos, the father of the after-Western Emperor Julius Nepos, and Idus. He restored much of Gaul and Hispania to Roman control. The Burgundians, Visigoths and Sway were all decisively defeated and reduced to federa status, astounding palms for an apparently dying Western Roman Empire. He also instigated laws to cover the armature of the Western Empire itself, which had begun to fall into seediness and ruin, of late evident to have a genuine desire to not only restore the home of the state but its former glory and culture too. Yet there was one last grand feat to negotiate: the reconquest of Vandal Africa, that lost fiefdom of the Western Roman Empire that had been captured by the defacers about 20 times before Majorian time. Strictly planning the reconquest, Majorian had indeed amassed the largest Western Roman fleet in centuries, 300 vessels near Carigo Nova, but unfortunately his line was destroyed in 461 whilst still at anchor, conceivably set on fire by serpents who were paid off by the defacers, therefore decomposed the last hope of the Romans to restore the Western Roman Empire to its former extent. On his way back to Italy, Majorian made a terrible mistake, videlicet, disbanding his army and only keeping a small particular sentry around him. The unfaithful Majus Militum Ricker, conspiring against him, had heard of this, riding hard and fast to block the emperor on his way to Rome. At the megacity of Torona, Majorian was tortured and executed in August of 461. Therefore ended the life of a remarkable figure who rightfully deserves the title last of the Romans. Within just a many times of Majorian murder, the situation had come indeed more hopeless than before his reign had begun. All of the territorial earnings that the emperor had made were reversed. The Suevic Goths and Burgundians were expanding and no longer considered federa but entirely independent countries. Worse, Marcellus of Dalmatia and Idus in Gaul had resolved down from the Western Empire, as a direct result of Ricker's prosecution of Majorian, forging their own coalitions whilst ever hanging to foray Italy themselves, but indeed also one last hope for the dying Western Empire surfaced. Anthemus, and frequently overlooked emperor, unjustly called the Greek on the Western throne, when in fact he too, like Majorian, gave everything to try and save the Western Empire, ultimately making the ultimate immolation. Antheus came emperor in 467, transferred to the West by the Eastern Emperor Leo I. Damascus tells us that he was conceivably a secret pagan and that he planned to restore the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill at Rome, and like the old emperors of days gone by, he reigned from Rome, and formerly one time into his reign he tried to laboriously save the conglomerate. Together with the Eastern Emperor and Marcellus of Dalmatia, a huge naval landing operation was organized in order to formally again try to reconquer the lost Western Roman fiefdom of Africa. To that end, Leo had amassed a giant fleet of over 1,000 vessels, and Anthemus had transferred Maus of Dalmatia to aid in this operation. So indeed as late as 468 Anthemus had tried to save the conglomerate, but sorely the commander of the Operation. A veritably unable Eastern Roman patricius called Basileus was wisecracked by Geric, and so the largest part of the line was destroyed at Cape Bon in 46-8. After this disaster still Anthemus didn't give up calling upon the help of the Romano-Briton Ramus to fight against the Visigoths in Gaul. Ramus, called King of the Briton, crossed over from Britain in 470, but he was eventually defeated by the Visigoths under their fierce King Yori eventually in one last hopeless attempt. Anthemus transferred forth his son Antholas together with 3 other Roman commanders and the last remnants of the Western Roman army to Gaul in order to fight against the Viso, but unfortunately this also failed. Antholas was killed in the end. Anthemus too would suffer the same fate as Majorian. Before him Ricker, the unfaithful Majus Militum of the Western Empire, came dissatisfied with Anthemus, his vigor trying to restore the conglomerate and therefore waste vital coffers, and so he marched on Rome to besiege the emperor in the Eternal City. Violent fighting replaced, and Ricker eventually sacked Rome in 472, chancing the emperor and having him killed, and so ended the last stylish stopgap for the Western Roman Empire. That Greek on the Western Roman throne deserves to be called the last Roman, much further than so numerous other Romans on the Western throne, since he too, like Majorian, gave his life in order to save the state. But we do have hints of other forlorn attempts at Roman survival too, indeed far beyond the borders of Italy, just as chaos reigned on the mainland on the distant shores of Britannia. Once the jewel and glory of the emperors who sailed beyond the ends of the earth, death had come from beyond the borders too, from the west and the north in the form of Pictish and Scottish aggressors, and from the east from Saxon, Anglian and Judish rovers, as well as Germanic greedy commanders, formerly long inside the fiefdom, and Romano-British usurpers, likewise nearly entirely lacking of literal sources and with little to go on in the continental accounts. Rather we must turn to the 6th century British monk Gildas for any semblance of a story, and in his fiery pical work on the ruin and subjection of Britain he gives us the name of one particularly valiant existent who 2 generations before his own time, in the alternate half of the 5th century announcement, around about the same time as Ramus king of the Britons made his passage into G, unified some kind of resistance against the Saxon raiders also besetting the western portions of the islet, winning an important palm and securing peace for times to come. His name was Ambrosius Orinus. According to Gild's account, Ambrosius, his parents had apparently worn the grandiloquent and been taken in it, suggesting some kind of durability from the Roman administration of the islet. It's for this reason that Gildas calls Ambrosius Aurelianus last of the Romans, maybe along with Ramus in part the original alleviation for the King Arthur legend. Ambrosius was latterly converted into King Arthur's uncle and ultimately intermingled with Merlin to form an entirely new character, an intriguing longevity for a figure we know next to nothing about, who may well have been a form of last Roman governor in Britain after utmost Roman colors had been withdrawn from the islet in 407 and it officially being left by 410, but whose grandparents may well have regaled him of tales of the conglomerate in his youth. Meanwhile on the mainland that empire still cleaved on by a thread in utmost conventional histories of the Western Roman Empire, and clearly in the popular imagination the last de facto Roman emperor in the West. And a figure frequently called a last Roman is the little Caesar Romulus Augustus, deposed by the Germanic general Oca in 476 to be replaced by a new system of kingship. He clearly was the last emperor to rule over Italy, though as we've seen he was far from the last Western emperor to rule anywhere, let alone in the EAS Empire, which would survive for another 1,000 times. Across the Adriatic in Dalmatia, where great Roman generals had been born and raised for centuries, Julius Nepos and his sympathizers, including the Eastern court, considered him not Romulus to be the last due emperor in the West. The son and heir at law of one of Majorian generals, Nepos Julius Nepos, originally went to Rome to depose Garius Poppet of the Burgundian general Gundobad, who sounded to be getting a new Ricker. His uncle Nepos had some original success against the Burgundians, bringing them back in line, but crucially, he failed to master the Visigoths. This, coupled with his erstwhile support of the Eastern Emperor Zeno being temporarily overthrown by a usurper, redounded in Nepos being forced to flee from his lately appointed and now nearly incontinently rebellious Magister Militum. Arrests, still backed by the Eastern Emperor Zeno and married to the former Emperor Leo's bastard Nepos, continued reigning in his home fiefdom of Dalmatia, until in 480, just as he planned another eruption on Italy, he was boggled by 2 of his generals. Julius Nepos was the last emperor to be culminated in Rome until the Frankish king Charlemagne in the time 800, and yet indeed Julius Nepos was not the last Western Roman sovereign to hold power over a substantial home, for in the north of Gaul, hemmed in by hostile powers on all sides, the sprawling remnants of the imperial fiefdom still held on after the Emperor Majorn was boggled in 461, replaced by Ricker's puppet Libus Sus, the Maist Militum in Gaul. Idus incontinently mutinied, presumably pledging his constancy to Emperor Leo in the east in order to retain some Legality with his legions he constantly hovered to foray Italy to depose the new emperor, and Ricker's governance big Gothic pressure proved too important to actually act still, though as a native of Gaul, maybe from a well-admired aristocratic family, Finn Idus was suitable to maintain order, and when he failed in around 465 he was succeeded by his son, far from an infelicitous heritable climate as so frequently happened in Roman history. Syagrius would hold on to the reins of power in a sprawling state extending from the borders of Brittany to Germany for an astonishing 20 times to come, holding off Childers Salon Franks for decades as well as making earnings against the Visigoths, only to eventually succumb to one of the most important Germanic leaders in all of history, Sherry's ambitious youthful son Clovis. At the Battle of Soissons in 486 Clovis was captured, and still executed his administration still, and presumably his army would largely survive, going on to form a major element in Clovis's new generality of a single united Francia, which would eventually turn into France. It's thanks to numbers like Syagrius that French is a Latin-deduced love language, not Germanic. Gallo-Roman life would continue in Francia, and to a certain extent the Roman way of life no way failed out there, going on to form a major part of the Merovingian and latterly Carolingian administrations. In the early Middle periods, Clovis was the last Western Roman sovereign, and in France in particular he's frequently considered last of the Romans, but an interpretation of Rome would survive in the successor fiefdoms that followed. Odoacer ruled Italy for 17 times, and though the Western Empire might have officially been gone, in reality veritably little had changed. Like utmost dogfaces of Germanic heritage whose ancestors had converted as important as 100 times before, Odoacer was an Arian Christian, and though distinct from the Roman Church he infrequently interposed in ecclesial matters, spending significant coffers in defending Italy from implicit Germanic raiders like the Rugii. After involving himself with a usurper's essay to erect the Eastern Emperor Zeno, still Oak's days were numbered. In 489 a new group on the scene, the Ostrogoths, formerly part of Attila's Hunnic Empire beyond the Danube, came crashing into Italy, eventually seizing Rena in 493. And killing Odoacer. There was to be no hostile sack by the Ostrogoths, still happy to present themselves as the new protectors of Rome. Odoacer was portrayed as a dictator, and the new Ostrogothic area steered in like Odo, aka's veritably much grounded on the Roman bone that came ahead. Theodoric, the sovereign of the Ostrogoths, was happy to maintain the Senate invested time in repairing and rebuilding Roman structure and devoted patronage to cultural and educational trials rather than a break. The reign of Theodoric was a durability of what had come ahead with a minor metamorphosis of the ruling class. It was into this system that a patronized figure would arise, frequently called last of the Romans due to his fidelity to knowledge and his deep desire to keep complete the world of before. Born in Italy just many short times after the fall of the Western Empire, Aeneas Manlius Severinus Boethus was an integral senator, consul ma officiorum, analyst and champion in Theodoric's kingdom. Boethius earned his title as last Roman because he was one of the veritably last true statesmen and legislators who, just as in the days of old, applied Roman politics, consummately being an excellent lecturer and pen in the Latin lingo. Compared by some to the likes of Cicero, Boethus lived and studied in the megacity of Rome. Still in those days, despite its repeated sackings relatively identical in form and in shape to the last decades of the Western Empire, unfortunately in the last many times of his reign, Theodoric the Great desisted to be as wise and as benevolent a sovereign as he'd formerly been, and after Buse took a contrary ecclesial station to the great king, one too numerous times he was executed. But there was another integral figure of the time too frequently patronized as maybe indeed lesser than Boethus. By the time Flavius Magnus Aurelius Codorus reached the end of his days in around 585 announcement, the formerly prosperous municipalities and metropolises of the Western Empire were hugely unrecognizable. From the time of his youth, Italy in particular had been prosperous in those days under the benevolent rule of the Ostrogoths, when Romans still held numerous significant political and societal positions, hailing from an elite senatorial family with links stretching back into the FTH century. And earlier, after the usual scholarly education, Cassiodorus rose through the species of society, getting consul in 514 and magister of Forum in 523, eventually getting a vital pillar of the Ostrogothic administration. War would soon arrive formally further, though this time when the Eastern Romans made an attempt to take back Italy for good. In the Holocaust that followed, the country would be scorched, devastated by times of fermentation, acting to still vanish from political life. Codorus spent his last 30 times in a friary where he wrote numerous authoritative workshop of history, utmost of which we sorely only have fractions of moment. It was during those times that the most ruinous invasion yet arrived in the form of the Lombards, still pagan heathens from beyond the Our. Italy was destroyed, its complicated regulatory administration overthrown as coalitions began to tear the promontory piecemeal. Most obviously visible of all, armature suffered largely as the classical structures of the History began to be left to ruin the stone king's secrets of the ancestors beginning to be forgotten, but in the east the empire still survived following the deaths of the last Western Roman emperors in the dying days of the 5th century. It was the still surviving eastern half of the empire grounded on Constantinople which saw itself as the true successor to Rome, particularly by the early 6th century, as none of the Western businesses were considered indeed negligibly part of the Roman state by 533. Also under the strong hand of the Emperor Justinian, the time was right for another crusade to the west, this bone a full-scale invasion by land and ocean to reconquer the lost businesses, with the ultimate thing being Rome itself. Justinian was presumably one of the last Eastern Roman emperors to speak Latin as a first language due to this fact and for his remarkable restoration juggernauts which were successful. For a brief time he's frequently considered the last Roman by some, yet Justinian leaned hard on one particular individual, frequently considered one of the topmost strategic and military minds in all of history. His name was Flavius Belisarius. In verity, Justinian probably would not have achieved anything at each without him, the stalwart general having kept him on his throne against revolutionists inside the capital during the early tumultuous part of his reign, latterly winning astounding palms in an IA Persia, Africa and eventually Italy, where he did against all the odds managed to wrest back the great megacity for a time from the Ostrogoths. Belisarius was the secret super-armament of the emperor, winning nearly every battle he ever fought despite frequently entering far too little support from the emperor and being leveled against rival generals for the emperor's favor for his inconceivable achievements in conquering 2 entire fiefdoms with an unexpectedly small army of not indeed 20,000 men. Belisarius is frequently called last of the Romans, but in Rome itself, as the bank cleared from the maelstrom of the Gothic wars, there were still individualities who sought to save the glory of the distant history. Not long after the deaths of Justinian and Belisarius there arose a person to power in Italy who, for his valiant sweats to save the glory of Rome, would occasionally be called the last Roman. He was born Gregorius Anus, but moment we know him as Pope Gregory the Great, the son of an assemblyman. Gregory came prefect of Rome at a youthful age, yet in those days, in the fate of the disastrous Gothic wars and with the Lombards sweeping down from the north to lay waste to Italy, the coffers demanded to repair the megacity could simply not be spared, not to mention the massive population decline and persecute that destroyed its occupants in this tumultuous time, with the megacity of Rome falling briskly into decay. Gregory did everything in his power to help the occupants of Rome and to save the structures as stylish he could, as well as conserving as important knowledge as he could in a great central library, eventually being made pope in 590. Realizing that the temporal power of Rome was likely gone ever, Gregory concentrated rather on winning over the hearts and minds of the pagan Germanic warrior elite, who now held sway in numerous part corridor of Europe, working hard to convert the heathen Lombards and further famously dispatching a charge to Britain to begin the conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxons, who'd set up a veritably different set of nations than those Christian Germanic bones on the mainland. Far from just a spiritual leader, Gregory was a veritably suitable statesman too, specially visiting Constantinople to convene with the primogenitor of the East and indeed with the emperor Tiberius too. For these achievements he has occasionally been called the last Roman, yet despite his stylish sweats the decay continued. By the early 8th century 100 times had passed since the days of Gregory the Great. Italy was also ruled by a myriad collection of countries, most of them Lombard, but with a number of Eastern Roman enclaves around major metropolises that no way fell. Rome itself had no way been conquered, moping on as a shadow of its former tone into this confusing political situation. There was one person who could in proposition be called the last Western Roman emperor, and though we know veritably little about his life, he might earn the title last of the Romans. His name was Tiberius Pedisus, Italian born usurper when corridor of Italy were still a part of the Eastern Empire, who may have roused up a kind of Italian independence movement in 730. Tiberius's reign still was short-lived, and in 731 he was killed in battle, his decapitated head transferred to the Eastern Emperor Leo III as a jewel. By the early 9th century events in northern Europe would change the conception of what it meant to be a Roman evermore. In the time 800 the all-important Frankish king Charlemagne rode down across the mounts to have himself culminated as a new emperor of the Romans, in actuality a fully different and new institution to that in the East. The title would be revived again and again over the preceding centuries, maybe most specially with the high medieval German tendency to call themselves Holy Roman Emperors, though a notorious idiosyncrasy reminds us moment that they weren't in fact holy nor Roman nor emperors. Nonetheless, this was largely lost on the people of Western Europe, who after Charlemagne's crowning in 800 didn't now fate the Eastern Romans as having any further of a licit claim to the race of ancient Rome. Thus we can turn to the last Eastern Roman emperor to sit on the throne of Constantinople before Charlemagne's imperial coronation, Constantine V. As an implicit seeker for the title of last Roman, as he was in actuality the last genuinely Roman emperor to be honored as similar in the West, though the two sides of the former empire would only drift further and further piecemeal over the times, unreconcilable, a situation only made worse during the drives when they came head to head in centuries of chaotic violent warfare. The Eastern Empire, generally known as Byzantium moment, though that's an expression used by 15th century chroniclers like Hieronymus Wolff, would survive for another 700 times, defeating all adversaries, holding out against basically the entire Middle East alone for a ridiculous quantum of time. But ultimately all effects must come to an end, though the world had irrevocably changed and would only continue to do so at further of a rapid-fire pace from also on by the 15th century. Toward the close of the medieval period, the emperors of Constantinople, now a rump state with a modest home, continued to see themselves as true Romans, the true successors of the Roman Empire, with an unbroken line of race stretching back all the way to the first emperor Augustus in the 1st century. Announcement: Eastern Romans had no way stopped pertaining to themselves as similar, and when Constantinople eventually fell in 1453, its last emperor Constantine VI Palaeologus, indeed bearing the name of the first Constantine of the 4th century, announcement has a good claim to being the last Roman. He fought courageously defending the megacity tooth and nail, and though not a great deal of information survives from his last moments, his last words do survive: the megacity has fallen, yet I'm still alive. Before charging alone into the vast army of Ottoman Turks surging through the breach in the walls, no way to be seen again. Because of this heroic defense of Constantinople, Constantine is frequently called the last Roman, and yet Constantinople was not the only holdout in the Eastern Empire. To the north of the Black Sea, the trading emporium of Trebizond had long thrived at a crossroads of north, south, east, and west, having broken down from Constantinople during the cataclysmic times of occupation by Latin Westerners in the 13th century, and latterly making itself useful to the colorful girding Turkic Muslim powers. The so-called conglomerate of Trebizond had managed to not only survive but thrive by the 15th century. Still 10 times after the fall of Constantinople, Trebizond's time was eventually up. Its final emperor David II Komnenos, frequently called the last Roman, was taken to Constantinople after the megacity fell, where he was executed along with his sons and Horson. Though amazingly there was one further Eastern Roman state yet to fall when the fortress of Venza eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1479, therefore officially ended the conglomerate that had lasted 1,500 times, though a successor state innovated after the Crusader sack and prisoner of Constantinople in 1200. For the commander of Venza, the Caesar of Epirus, Leonardo III Tco, is frequently said to have ruled over the veritably last Eastern Roman remnant state, and therefore listed as one of the veritably final campaigners to be considered the last Roman. As we've seen, it's an extremely delicate task to call one specific person that outstanding title, and though this list is long, it's by no means complete. There were numerous heirs and campaigners over the long centuries, all of them outstanding characters playing a vital part in the 1500s history of the Roman Empire. In reality, there were numerous last